And bonjour. This is Bruno LARVOL, and you're listening to LARVOL and Friend, our weekly podcast when we talk about all topics related to medical affairs, but also competitive intelligence and other businesses LARVOL is involved with. LARVOL is a SaaS company. We sell software and data solutions to the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. And today, our guest, Patrina Pellet, is going to talk with us about KOLs. So, welcome very much to the podcast, Patrina.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And the connection we had started with Clubhouse. I think that's where we met. And it's interesting how Clubhouse, of course, went through a lot of hype, and now essentially nobody is there anymore. I'm not even sure it exists. But I think that's where we actually met. So thank you, Clubhouse, for that connection.
Yeah, was it
So
podcast? It probably was. I think
it was
Clubhouse
Clubhouse.
has actually died in medical affairs. I think it's still going strong elsewhere.
Oh, I see. It got replaced mostly by Twitter Space, which copied it, and because it was native to Twitter, I think took over. But it grew so fast, and then it disappeared. It's fascinating to me how these things happen. Um, in the world of healthcare, the trends are much slower. So you and I see trends in KOLs, for example. They take much longer, hopefully, and they don't crash that way. So before we talk about KOLs, and I might ask you your definition of KOLs and what you learn in your career as a medical affairs expert and working with many interesting companies. Would you mind giving us a quick walkthrough, a couple of highlights of your career and your experience in medical affairs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually start by going back a little bit further. So, because folks usually find this very interesting. So I actually grew up off the grid in Alaska. And then moved away from Alaska when I was 18 to go to college. And I always like to bring that up because people think it's really cool.
It is cool. I did not know that about you. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so sometimes I think when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, that's why she's so weird. That explains a lot."
I was thinking that's why you're so tough.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that.
Yes, yes, because I always think about you as someone very confident and tough, and in the good sense of the word. And growing up in the cold weather and maybe the elements, or maybe you were in the center of a big city. By the way, I don't know, but I have that image in my mind of building characters.
Yeah, nice. Um, awesome. Okay, well, more relevant to the conversation today, I got my PhD in cell biology from Yale about 10 years ago. I worked in a different industry for 5 years and then was recruited into the medical affairs space. So I have been working as a medical affairs expert for the last 5 years across all aspects of medical affairs, especially when it comes to insights, data, KOLs, and how we can use all this information to drive data-driven decision making.
Um, so you saw a lot of situation. You work for small company and larger companies in the KOL engagement and the medical affairs world. Let's start at the beginning because some people listening to the podcast knows everything about KOLs. Others, maybe not so much. What is a KOL, and why should we care about KOLs?
That's a great question. And I'll point out to the audience right now that Bruno is asking me a trick question. Um, and I'll tell you why. So a KOL stands for a key opinion leader. And the trick question part is the question of what is a KOL? And what I've seen working with a number of medical affairs teams across all sizes of pharma is that there isn't really a single definition of what a KOL is. So that's why I think he's trying to trick me here.
Yes, yes. Some people, for example, are just calling all HCPs that pharma are tracking or pharmas are interested in engaging with. They call them all KOL, but they're not all really influential. For example, they could be influenced perhaps, or they could be engaged, or they could be scientifically engaged into a conversation, but they don't necessarily all have true influence. They're not all a leading voice, right?
Yes, correct. So what I've seen is that a lot of medical affairs teams will create a definition of a KOL based off of their medical strategy or their key business objectives. So there isn't a magical definition for every company because every medical strategy is slightly different. And then to speak a little bit on this difference between KOLs and HCPs, and I agree, some folks use this interchangeably. I would say in general, the KOL is reserved for HCPs that will help meet a key strategic objective, whereas an HCP is more a general term. So anybody that is providing care to a patient. Bruno, do you agree with that? Do you see folks kind of distinguishing it that way as well?
I, I do. And I also notice that they sometimes use a lot of alternative word and a key expert or thought leader. It's a little bit like if the name or the label of KOL became a little bit negative in the eyes of some doctors. There might be the perception that KOLs are in the pocket of pharma. Um, and so people are trying to find different other words, be less charged to describe a physician with influence, essentially.
Yeah, I think there's a paper from around 2012 or 2013 that showed some pretty convincing data that some physicians were really influenced by pharma. So I think that's where that perception comes from.
Now, the definition of engagement with KOL is very specific, though, and defined, meaning that the pharma company cannot promote anything to a KOL that is not on label. And so their job essentially is to engage according to very specific rules, very compliant, sensitive rules, to engage scientifically. I mean, the FDA could not say you cannot answer scientific questions, even outside of the label of a drug. They'll be stifling for the scientific conversation. So they created an avenue, a very regulated avenue of compliant and ethical interaction between a pharma company and doctors. And that's what created the world of medical affairs, the world of KOL. That's the way I'm looking at the situation. Do you agree with that description? Does it make sense from your own experience?
Yeah, and I would actually highlight the regulation piece of this. So when I'm talking to folks outside of the industry, I think that pharmaceutical companies kind of have a bad definition or a bad reputation. But what a lot of folks don't realize is how highly regulated this space is. And to your point, Bruno, there are rules around how medical affairs companies, or not companies, medical affairs teams, pharma companies can engage with KOLs. And to your point, it's they're not allowed to speak off label. And if they do, they can get in really big trouble. And especially in terms of the medical affairs space, these folks are compliance expert. That's part of their job. So they make sure that we're not breaking any of these rules when engaging with doctors and not being overly promotional and really ensuring that we are talking about the fair and unbiased view of the data.
Some time ago, of course, there have been always some practices that were not ideal,
Yeah.
and gifts and lavish dinners and so on. But the industry became extremely strict about what they can do and cannot do. I don't think a pharmaceutical representative or a pharmaceutical medical science liaison can even give a simple pen anymore.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
absolutely not.
Right? They cannot give anything. There used to be that there's so many pens,
Yeah.
collections of pens, that the pharmaceutical industry would give fancy pens, amazing pens, to doctors with the name of their drug on it and notepad, all kinds of things. And now there's essentially they cannot give anything whatsoever. And that's a good idea because the pharma industry, and that's a topic that always I find interesting, but also a little sad. The pharma industry, despite the fact that it's there to try to develop new drugs for terrible diseases, doing a lot of medical research, people think about the pharma industry as in grouped with I don't know the gun manufacturers, right? And the oil and gas, right? The polluters, and that's where the pharma industry is perceived sometimes. And now you could say, well, that's unfair, but I mean, it doesn't matter. The point is, what can we do as part of the pharma industry? We're contributing, we're supporting that industry. We think it's a good industry. We think it's good to try to find a drug for Alzheimer and for triple negative breast cancer. It's all very good. We should spend a lot of resources for that. We should have a lot of money for that instead of for new website technology. But we need to do it ethically, and we need to build a better reputation for the industry. And anything we can do to do that is good. And I think that medical affairs and the way we engage with KOLs could be part of that solution.
Yeah, I think medical affairs is already leading the charge on this by being the compliance experts. And I agree with you around this reputation of these big lavish dinners and stuff. And I think that was really perpetuated by movies. And I do think that actually happened like 20 years ago. So if you talk to pharma reps from 20 years ago, they will tell you stories around doctors demanding to be taken out to dinner and stuff. But that has totally changed from 20 years ago. And you probably saw this as well, Bruno. I think 2 years ago, there was new regulation or new pharma code recommendations you're not even allowed to buy HCP's alcohol anymore.
Yes. Oh, you can buy other things to drink and eat, but no alcohol? Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah, they even cut off alcohol. So you can have approved lunches or lunch and learns with very set parameters and how much money they're spending on the food, for example, and no more alcohol is allowed.
Cannabis is okay?
Sorry?
Cannabis?
Oh, probably not.
Probably
I'm
not.
not there. I don't think that one was officially
Officially, okay.
laid out, but I'm assuming that's a no.
I started my career in Paris working for Sandoz at the time. And I remember being so surprised by what was happening in the pharmaceutical industry. And yes, the reps were essentially helping the sales by these dinners and these relationships that were a little bit or a lot, frankly, not very ethical. And it was so weird for me because also I heard, a drug that sells the most, the more expensive a drug is, the more it sells. Because everybody assumes they're better. And also because people don't pay for their own drug. So everybody wants the most expensive drug in France and maybe all over the world because they're not paying for it. And the price is a proxy of value. And what they said also is at the time is the more side effect a drug has, the more people believe that it actually does something.
Oh, interesting.
And so that was my first experience in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a weird industry in many ways, and it's a good industry, but we have our challenges, and we have a public relation challenge. So today's conversation perhaps can be a little bit of a part of that reflection about how do we, through very ethical, very compliant, nearly obsessed with compliance, frankly, which is what medical affair is, obsessed with compliance. And not just the letter of compliance, but the spirit, right? The ethical consideration. So that's really what it is. So dealing with KOL is ethically interacting with people who are important to your company, but in a way that is not unethically or, of course, illegally influencing their prescription.
Yep, absolutely. And I think medical affairs teams are really doing this already, in terms of how they are engaging and making sure that they're really focusing on the science. So the conversations and engagement with HCPs and KOLs are really founded in what the science is telling us. And there's a really big focus on being fair and unbiased. And so I think this is going to help improve the perception of pharma companies. It'll spread, and I have to say, for the folks listening that are maybe outside of the pharma industry, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, Bruno. A lot of people in pharma are very passionate about creating better patient outcomes for patients and creating treatments for patients that don't have any current options. So I think about that a lot when I'm thinking about the bad reputation of the pharma industry, that there are actually a lot of really good people in there. And there are some bad examples that have tarnished it for everybody. But I would say overall, everybody is working with the patient's best interest in mind.
Absolutely. Um, so I've never been an MSL myself, but I worked with a lot of MSLs, the medical science liaison, the people who are interacting with the key opinion leaders. And my understanding about that interaction is that there's a few principles that need to be followed. And the first, one of them you mentioned, which is to be balanced, to be fair and balanced.
Yeah.
It sounds like a talk show on Fox News, I guess. It needs to be fair and balanced. But so I'll ask you in a second, how do you know that it's fair and balanced? Is there a test? But before that, there's another principle, which is, I think, you have to only be reactive. You cannot say, hey, Dr. Patrina, here's some information about this drug that does XYZ. It needs to be you coming to me with a question. I cannot ask you to dance. You have to ask me to dance. Is that correct?
So this is a really interesting question around what folks in medical affairs will call being reactive or proactive. So there are a lot of companies that are concerned that if you do outreach to doctors, that this might be viewed as proactive. This is kind of what you're getting at, right, Bruno?
Yes.
So this is also a pretty tricky area, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing across the companies that you all work with. There is no one definition, and how compliance folks define the different levels of reactivity or proactivity are different across companies. So you will see some medical science liaisons that are not allowed to do any proactive outreach at all. You'll see other MSLs at different companies that have very set parameters around being able to do a little bit of, I'm using air quotes here for the medical affairs people that are listening, but uh, proactive outreach.
Um, and so then there's a question of fair and balance. How do I know when I'm presenting something, or let's say I'm preparing the material that we're going to share with a KOL? Well, if it's material, I guess compliance can vet it.
Yeah.
And can say, well, compliance looked at it, and yes, it's fair and balanced. But if I'm talking with Dr. Smith, how do I, and she's asking questions, how do I know that I'm fair and balanced and I guess factual?
Yeah. So a lot of all MSLs are highly trained or tend to be highly trained in this area because it is a really big compliance concern. So most teams will go through training on compliance and how to address questions like this. So I think one way to think about it is how the training and how they respond to questions like this. Additionally, in terms of fair and balanced, a lot of teams will achieve this by ensuring that they're talking about all the data that's out there. So you could imagine a situation where if you're only talking about your new clinical trial results, that's not being fair and balanced because you're not talking about everything. So not that MSLs are talking about going out and promoting other companies' data, but it's about this unbiased view of the whole landscape. Do you agree with that, Bruno? What do you think?
Um, I agree, and I could see how I'm sure it's a balancing act, because if a doctor asks me about the new data that my company just released at ASCO, for example, at the cancer conference, um, the question is about my data, and out of compliance, I'm going to start talking about, yeah, and there's also the data from that other company and that other company, and the care was, well, that's not what I'm asking you, Bruno. I'm asking about your data. So I'm sure
Yeah.
practically we find a balance with all of that in a way that that is still compliant. But I understand the spirit of this. Ultimately, it's a subjective assessment. And I think that if the medical science liaison professional is interested in the spirit of the law, meaning being scientific and clinical, and not promotional, and not trying to manipulate an interaction towards a prescription of an off-label nature, then I think it's all good. Then, by helping the KOL, the physician, the HCP, knowing what's going on in that field of research, you help everybody perhaps, or you help your company disproportionately because you're a leader in that area, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think keep in mind that most MSLs are trained in science. So the majority of folks are PharmDs, MDs, and PhDs. So they really have a good understanding of the scientific method, designing experiments. And so I think the uh, viewpoint, or to use your word, the spirit of MSLs is really about the education of the science. Like, what is the science actually telling us? And so kind of coming from that viewpoint.
Um, as a medical science liaison, uh, how can I help my KOL? Well, let me answer very generally, and then I have a question in particular as it relates to presentations that the KOL will have to make, for example, in that context. But both broadly and in the context of preparing for symposium, preparing for presentations, or even webinars, for example, how can an MSL help a KOL and still doing that in a compliant way and in an ethical way?
So what do you mean exactly? Like, how are they preparing for speaker bureaus or anything like that? Or
Let's say I'm a KOL and I'm about to participate to a symposium.
Mhm.
Uh, is my MSL going to reach out to me and say, oh, I noticed that you're listed to be presenting at a symposium. In case you need the data that we have on that topic, and maybe other data as well, we'll be glad to send it to you. Or is
Mm.
that too forward?
I think many people would think that's too forward. So I thought your question was more about if the MSL is working with one of their KOLs for an ad board or a presentation or whatnot. I think that's a good question. I'm not sure how they're what I don't think there's one single answer for it.
I understand. Yes. Could you be an MSL yourself? Or no, you're looking at it from outside, but you wouldn't want that job.
Oh, that's a funny question. Somebody was just asking me that earlier if I would want to become an MSL. I think the MSL position is a really great position, and I don't want to travel very much personally, so that's why it's not a good fit for me. But are you trying to get me hired as a MSL, Bruno?
Uh, at some point, I thought there was a terrific business during the pandemic and after, which is a virtual MSL team that doesn't travel and
Mm.
that does only remote interaction with the KOLs. and build relationships and interact, answer questions, again, non-proactively, in a reactive way, but still builds a report, a scientific credibility, a clinical interaction, but never travels, never go even to conferences, only remote. And therefore, as an MSL, you could be a digital nomad, you could be traveling and then engaging remotely. What do you think? Should we start that company, Patrina, you and I?
Yeah, that would be good. We could start recruiting right now with this podcast. I
Yeah, that's it.
I
So
think
if
it
you
still exists, right? The
it
virtual MSL.
it does exist a little bit, right? There are a few companies with virtual MSL teams. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it also has a lot to do with which therapeutic area you're in. So a lot of times if you are your uh, therapy or your area is focusing around primary care, for example, a lot of times these folks prefer to engage virtually and they don't tend to go to conferences anyways.
Yes. Um, Now you know, and we're getting toward the end of the podcast, but you know that in my company we do a lot of work in the metaverse. We put a headset on, and then we work. All of our work is done actually in our virtual office. With the first company, 150 people, all of them working exclusively in the
Yeah.
office, but in a virtual office. And we had in the past several people involved in medical affairs saying, could we use that approach and engage with KOLs in the metaverse? Could we organize advisory board, ad boards, which are just in a virtual space? And the reason why people were asking for that is that when you zoom in a meeting and you're a KOL, you probably don't. I mean, it's very tempting not to engage, to just listen in and to multitask. I mean, these people are so busy that it's not the same as meeting in person. So the thought is that if you have a headset on and you're immersed into a virtual amphitheater where data is presented and the level of engagement will be better. So we get a lot of interest for that type of engagement with KOLs.
I think that's a great idea because to your point, even when we're on a Zoom meeting, we're all multitasking, right? We're not really paying attention. But if you're in this virtual office space, you'll feel like you're being held more accountable. Like you should be paying attention.
You should. Yes, yes. So we only have a couple of minutes left. It's been a pleasure to have you in the podcast to talk about KOLs and trends. And at the end, our tradition, of course, is to ask our guests to formulate a takeaway for the listeners, something that if they remember only one thing from all of our discussion today, that would be the sentence. And then Shahir Sheikh, our producer, is going to take that quote and post it next to our podcast in all the places where the podcast is going to be listed. So, Patrina, what is your takeaway for today?
Well, this is a lot of pressure. I hope I don't mess this up. I would say whether you are in medical affairs or outside of this particular industry, that you should be thinking more broadly about your stakeholder group. So everyone has their traditional set of stakeholders that they're engaging, but as the world becomes more and more complicated, this set of stakeholders is getting broader and broader. If you want to succeed and be very strategic, you will want to think more broadly about all the stakeholders and how they influence each other. What do you think of that,
Vi-
Bruno? Was that a good?
I appreciate it. I love it. And thinking broadly, thinking out of the box, and considering all stakeholders. Thank you very much, Patrina. And I hope we'll have you again another time on the podcast.
Yes,
Au revoir
absolutely. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
and bye bye.